Hey guys, Caleb here from CDBS Studios. So, with Avengers Doomsday around the corner at the end of this year, I've been on a kick recently to rewatch a lot of older Marvel movies that I know are either going to factor into Doomsday or are going to eventually factor into Secret Wars. And there's a lot of these movies that are genuinely really good. And one of my first big resurgences back onto the YouTube platform was with my first ever ranking video, that being ranking the MCU. And conveniently, that video is entirely outdated, as many things have changed since I made that. But that video got me thinking about that, as I later have gone on to rank other parts of Marvel that either were not included in that original video or have been getting updates. Like, I did a ranking of all of the Phase 5 projects when that phase wrapped up, which was mostly everything from the MCU video with like 3 things added, and I went ahead and ranked the Defender Saga seasons. But seeing as the Marvel universe is a lot bigger now consisting of the multiverse, there is one Marvel franchise that I've kind of been getting a really big kick on, especially with Doomsday on the corner, that being the 20th Century Fox X-Men franchise. Now, this franchise is constantly berated as one of the worst Marvel Cinematic Universes, which is just no, because the Sonyverse exists, but this franchise was definitely very up and down, with having some really solid movies that are actually in many ways better than 90% of the MCU's output, but also having a lot of garbage to contend with, and the franchises just genuinely had really bad continuity. Like, they tried to reboot the Fox X-Men franchise like 3 times just to make it work, and it never really worked. But I thought it would be really fun to kind of build up to Doomsday and Secret Wars by going through and ranking some of these other areas of Marvel that form what I am now coining as the MCM, or Marvel Cinematic Multiverse, basically consisting of the MCU and many of the other things in it, which the Fox X-Men are included in. So I figured we'd make a bunch of individual videos ranking some of these side Marvel collections, and then eventually after Doomsday, or probably after Secret Wars, I can make a big mega ranking video as an homage to my original MCU video that includes everything that I'm going to talk about. So, seeing as I already ranked the Defender Saga and Phase 5, let's go ahead and rank the Fox X-Men franchise. Now, this franchise is definitely going to be very weird to rank, as there's a lot of different things moving at play. Just to say something straight up, we are only counting the 13 main projects that are in this universe, that being the main X-Men franchise, the Wolverine trilogy, and the Deadpool films. No, I will not be including Deadpool and Wolverine, because even though it's technically the finale to the Fox X-Men franchise, it's an MCU film, so I don't really think it counts for the purposes of this video. Also, no, I will not be including the side Deadpool things like Deadpool No Good Deed and Once Upon a Deadpool, because, well, Once Upon a Deadpool is basically just Deadpool 2, but PG-13 for some random reason, so I'll just kind of lump those together when we get there. And also, no, I will not be including The Gifted or Legion, even though technically they're part of the Fox X-Men franchise, but I not watch them and I don't want to. And they kind of just they're technically not even really canon to the Fox X-Men, so I don't really think they count. So, minusing all of that, we have 13 films to deal with in today's ranking, ranging from good to also really bad. So this should be a really fun ranking video for you guys. I don't think I'm going to have fun with like half of this video. So anyway, let's just jump into it and rank the 13 projects that are part of the Fox X-Men franchise. Guys, I can't believe it. Fox has actually created a superhero film that might take the cake for the worst Marvel film ever created. Yes, I am not joking. The MCU and other Marvel project franchises have their fair share of crappy films, things like Madam Web, Thor: Love and Blunder, and even things like She-Hulk and Secret Invasion. But Fox has gone ahead and created a film that is genuinely worse than the entire MCU and Sonyverse combined. And that is, of course, X-Men Dark Phoenix. I mean, come on, Fox. What are we doing here? I mean, I know technically this film kind of got screwed over because of the Fox Disney merger, but that's really not an excuse. So, what happens in this movie, you're probably wondering? Well, this is Fox's second attempt at trying to do the Dark Phoenix storyline, Jean Grey's most famous storyline from the X-Men comics, and they did it in two films in the same cinematic universe. Like, what is that? And in many ways, this film is in some ways better than that initial attempt because this one actually delves into some of the actual terror that comes from Jean Grey starting to turn evil with a force she cannot control, as we see characters like Cyclops and Charles both actively struggling to control Jean and make her not kill everybody. And it's a very fun little story that you can definitely tell they put some actual thought this time into dealing with the Dark Phoenix storyline. And then Jessica Chastain shows up playing an alien known as the Dar-Ben, also one of the worst MCU villains from the Marvels, and the movie just entirely loses me because all of a sudden the movie is no longer about the Jean Grey Dark Phoenix stuff, it's now about this alien race and Geonosia with Magneto, and it's like, what are we doing here? Like, it's like, yeah, what are we doing here? Like, I was really invested in that initial plot line of the Jean Grey Dark Phoenix storyline, but I just do not care about the Dar-Ben aliens. Like, they are just such boring villains and literally only exist to actually have a threat for Jean Grey to go up against after she turns good again at the end. They bring back in Quicksilver and Mystique, but they do nothing because for some reason halfway through the film they, I guess, couldn't afford Jennifer Lawrence anymore, so they had Jean Grey kill off Mystique, and then for some reason Quicksilver is also just gone from the movie for the rest of it. Like, I don't know why. Like, he didn't die. Why is he doing this? And literally this plot point only exists to give Beast a reason to hate Jean Grey so that he can go recruit Magneto to kill her, but then he doesn't kill her, so what was the point of that subplot? And literally the only thing in this entire film that I liked was there's this really cool action sequence near the end where they're on this train and you have all of the X-Men fighting the Dar-Ben to protect Jean, which I thought was a really cool sequence. It was the only thing in the movie that was worth anything, but that's literally the only thing in this entire movie that makes any sense whatsoever. This movie just blows. It is a worthless void where superhero media goes to die. The only thing that is good is that train sequence. So congratulations, Fox. I guess Dark Phoenix gets to be a 1 out of 10 movie instead of a 0 out of 10. Congratulations. Hugh Jackman getting cast as Wolverine might be one of the greatest casting choices that we've ever had in superhero media, alongside characters like Robert Downey Jr. and Tobey Maguire. Unfortunately, Hugh Jackman's first solo film was not his best thing ever. Yeah, X-Men Origins Wolverine is really not a great film at all, as this was the first attempt outside of the original Fox X-Men trilogy to try to continue the franchise, but their first attempt was not very great, as the whole premise of this film is it's supposed to be Wolverine's origins, taking us from his childhood all the way to where we eventually meet him in the first X-Men film. But the route to get there is very, very murky, as this film does have some phenomenal moments, like diving way deeper into the Weapon X program was a really cool thing in this film after getting it referenced a lot in X2 X-Men United. I really loved seeing that origin of Wolverine and seeing him get his adamantium skeleton and him just kind of having this whole remorse with Stryker, who's one of the best non-mutant X-Men villains, so he was really fun to see in the film. I loved that. But after that, the film kind of is a huge nosedive because the whole premise is that Wolverine is trying to track down Sabretooth as he killed his girl. But the premise is basically just, oh, we're going to go to this old couple's house, and Hugh Jackman's going to hide out there for a little bit as he learns about his new adamantium skeleton. Oh, then they are going to die, and he has to drive off to a new location where he meets these other mutants that he used to be friends with. Oh, now they're going to die. Okay, now we got to go to meet up with Gambit, who's pretty epic, but he's not really in most of the movie. Oh, and then we're going to go to this nuclear power plant, which is going to be pretty cool. Oh, what's going to happen here? Oh, it's going to be some lazy twist villain reveal, and honestly, one of the worst adaptations of a superhero to film in all of fiction with the form of this new version of Deadpool. Yeah, the plot of this movie really kind of blows, which is a shame because I did really love a lot about this film when it came to diving into Logan's backstory and also the Weapon X stuff. But after the Weapon X thing happens, there really isn't a lot to be had with the rest of the film. I mean, again, this was also one of the first times they started contradicting themselves because how on earth is Patrick Stewart's Charles Xavier here in a wheelchair when he's not supposed to be in the wheelchair, even though he was supposed to be walking in a previous scene in a flashback. Cyclops doesn't know who Logan is, even though he shows up in this movie. And how does Patrick Stewart not know who Logan is when he shows up in this movie? And it doesn't matter. Logan got shot with an adamantium bullet, so he doesn't remember. So we don't have to worry about this movie for the rest of the franchise, right? Oh, man. Look, again, I think that this was a fine movie, and it definitely has enjoyable elements. Like I mentioned, the Weapon X stuff and the Logan backstory is really well handled, but everything else about this movie is not good. Like, I'm sorry, Hugh Jackman Wolverine fans, like, his first solo outing in the trilogy was not very solid, and it's easily one of the worst things Fox did with the X-Men franchise. But it's not Dark Phoenix levels of bad, so it at least gets to rank the second to last place instead of actually being last place. Because again, there's actually stuff I like about this movie, which is more than Dark Phoenix can say. So X-Men The Last Stand is a very interesting film to talk about in the Fox X-Men franchise because it was the finale to the OG X-Men trilogy, and it's the film that kind of also set off in places all of these areas for spin-offs that eventually gave us some of the best films in the X-Men franchise. But unfortunately, X-Men The Last Stand is a film that doesn't know what it wants to be, and so there's so much going on that you don't even really know what the film is supposed to be about for the whole runtime. The main plot line that the movie hinges itself on is that previously mentioned Dark Phoenix storyline where Jean Grey starts to get this controlled by this force she cannot control and has all that, but it really doesn't amount to anything because it just makes Jean Grey evil. And then she has the scenes early on where she like blows up at some of the X-Men before storming off. And then she teams up with Magneto for the rest of the movie, and then it's just not part of the film until the very end, where we have the epic scene where Logan goes up against her, which was a cool sequence, but it just doesn't really amount to anything. And then we have another side plot that's supposed to be about a mutant cure, and it sets up a really cool premise about, do some of the mutants take this mutant cure, or do they not? And it's really cool to see some of the X-Men, like Rogue, grapple with this idea, while other X-Men like Wolverine and Storm are like, our mutations aren't curses, they're gifts. And then the movie still wants to carry over the Brotherhood of Mutants plotline, where you have Magneto going after the mutant cure with characters like Juggernaut, who's pretty epic. But after that, and then we also get some cool additions to the X-Men. Of course, this was the first film Beast showed up in, who's pretty awesome as well. And we even got to see other characters like Kitty Pryde join the team. We got more Iceman, who was great. But apart from that, again, the plot doesn't know what it wants to be because we have these three subplots that are never given the time they need to really be fleshed out, to the point where it really means that nothing really happens through the most of the midpoint in this movie. And this movie then also tries to have emotional moments where it wants to kind of showcase Jean Grey's powers. They have her kill Cyclops off screen, which is just more evidence I'm going to talk about later, how James Marsden basically got shafted by Fox in the X-Men franchise. And then they also have her kill off Charles Xavier, which is just to show her power level, which is fine in a vacuum. But if you know the Fox X-Men franchise, he doesn't even stay dead for this entire movie. So, like, what was the point of killing him off? It does allow for some great moments, though, as we get to see Storm take over as leader of the X-Men, which was a pretty cool character. I'm finally glad Storm got something to do in the Fox films. But other than that, though, this movie really kind of blows. It has a lot of solid elements that I really love, and it's definitely not a terrible movie, but it definitely is just a movie that's so conjumbled in its second act that it really drags down the high score I want to give it. So, unfortunately, Last Stand can't go any higher, but it definitely is not the worst thing that Fox ever did with the X-Men franchise. X-Men Apocalypse is the one film in this franchise that I have a really solid emotional connection to, as it was the first X-Men film I ever saw in theaters. So I obviously have a huge emotional attachment to the Fox X-Men, X-Men Apocalypse, and the younger cast in general, because that's just the cast I grew up with. But going back to rewatch X-Men Apocalypse for this video, I really have started to notice that this film is not as great as I thought it was once. As this film, again, is a film that has so much going on that it really doesn't know what it wants to do. First off, we got to talk about the villain. We got Apocalypse himself, played wonderfully by Oscar Isaac. And he has a really fun premise throughout this story about being a mutant from ancient times who transferred his consciousness from different bodies to get different mutant powers, and giving him also, as he assembles his Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which is really cool, getting to see Magneto in there. We get a new, younger version of Storm, Angel, Psylocke, who's really cool. And overall, I really do love that side of the story. Unfortunately, the villain does kind of get a little overshadowed by Magneto because they wanted to do a interesting story about trying to make Magneto redeemable, but at the same time, they needed to make him be part of the Apocalypse Horsemen. And surprisingly, they made his story so much more engaging than Apocalypse himself, which I found really interesting. So that was really curious. And then on the X-Men side, we of course still are carrying over our characters from the previous X-Men films in the prequel era, where we got Mystique, Quicksilver returns, who is pretty awesome. And I love the story they did with him, where he is where he now knows that he's the son of Magneto, and he kind of tries to grapple with that idea, which is really fun. Of course, we have the whole Sweet Dreams sequence with him, which is one of my favorite sequences in the Fox X-Men franchise. I just love it so much. And we've got, of course, Charles and all that carrying over. But the film also decides it's going to introduce us to some of the younger versions of some of the other OG X-Men. So, of course, we get to see Cyclops in this movie, played by Ty Sheridan, which I'm not going to say he got more to do than James Marsden's version, but I definitely think he is doing a little better than he did. We get to see a younger version of Jean Grey, who's pretty cool. They introduce a young version of Jubilee for some reason, but then do literally nothing with her in this film or the next, so I genuinely wonder why she was added. And of course, we got the younger version of Nightcrawler as well, who's pretty awesome, but this film then suffers from the fact that also it doesn't give those new characters like anything to do. Like Nightcrawler and Cyclops are part of the team and they get to do some cool stuff, but they really give most of the plot stuff to Jean because they have to justify her going into Dark Phoenix in the next film. So they kind of have to do it, which is kind of annoying. But other than that, the rest of the new X-Men are pretty cool, and I do love seeing them come together and Mystique kind of becoming their leader, which I thought was a fun role for her, as since we're going to make Mystique an anti-hero anyway, we might as well do something interesting with her character. But other than that, Apocalypse is a very mixed movie where it does definitely have a lot of stuff I really love about it. Mainly, I do love some of the stuff again, with Magneto. I do love some of the things they do with the new X-Men. But overall, it's a film that's very conjumbled in its plot and everything going on, to the point where I don't think it ranks any higher. But it is definitely a fun film, and I do have a lot of emotional nostalgia for it, being the first X-Men film I saw in theaters. But going back to rewatch it, I realized it wasn't really the top tier X-Men film I used to think it was. So, sorry, X-Men Apocalypse. Man, Wolverine is not really faring well throughout this video because, man, his solo films weren't really going well. The Wolverine is a very interesting middle chapter in the Wolverine trilogy because it's not really doing anything super amazing like the third installment did, but it's also not doing anything I vitriolically hate or am bored out of my mind with, like X-Men Origins Wolverine. So what does the Wolverine have? Well, let's talk about it. So the premise of this movie is that after the events of X-Men The Last Stand, Hugh Jackman's Wolverine has kind of crawled into a bottle and is kind of just praying for death almost. And then he gets shipped off to Japan, where he meets this guy he saved from the bombing of Nagasaki. And then he basically goes on this whole journey to try to protect his daughter from this kind of mob, while also finding out that his powers have somehow been nullified. So it's kind of a mortality tale for Wolverine while he protects this daughter while fighting ninjas in Japan. overall, that's actually a pretty fun premise for a Wolverine film, and I did really enjoy the action sequences in this film. Like, there's this really epic sequence about halfway through where Wolverine is fighting these ninjas on a moving train, which I thought was really cool. The fight scene he does have with a ninja when he finally does get his powers back is pretty epic. And overall, there's a lot of really enjoyable stuff with Wolverine's action in this film. It might be one of the best films for that. And overall, such a great film overall. The main thing that falls apart for me mainly is the villains. This film's Silver Samurai is very lackluster, and the twist they try to pull with him is so blatantly obvious that it's not really greatly written. And then they bring in Viper to have a secondary villain who's present throughout the whole film before the Silver Samurai twist, and she's, again, not that interesting of a character, and I don't really like her that much, but she definitely serves the purpose the movie needs to have her part of the film to get Hugh Jackman out of power, and then she kind of fights him until the very end where Hugh Jackman gets his powers back, and then she kind of dies, so whatever. The Wolverine is basically a very interesting middle chapter in the Wolverine franchise, and it doesn't really do anything that super offends me, but it also doesn't do anything that, like, I think is worthy of being one of the best films to come out of the Fox X-Men franchise, so unfortunately I can't really rank any higher, but I do think it's an enjoyable movie, but it's not enough to save it instead of or elevated above the actual masterpieces that we're going to be talking about later on this list. So, sorry, Wolverine. The New Mutants really should be a film that is way higher on this list because on paper, this film sounds right up my alley. A horror film set in the X-Men universe following younger characters that are not connected to the rest of the X-Men franchise. Like, this film just feels like a film I should love because it basically is just a horror X-Men breakfast club. Like, that genuinely just feels like a film that I should absolutely adore in this franchise. Unfortunately, the film is just really kind of boring for most of it, as the film has very interesting premise, as I like the characters for the most part. I think they're all very well made, well written, and I do really love their premises, and overall they're all acted pretty well. Like, I love Anya Taylor-Joy as Magic in this film, and of course you have Charlie Heaton in there as well from Stranger Things, so there's a lot to enjoy from that. And overall, the premise is really, really fun about how this academy that they're all staying at kind of slowly devolves into chaos, and it kind of is all of them facing their deepest fears, which is a really fun premise for a film, and I do really love the film overall. I do really love how they kind of introduce this doctor who is basically the main villain threat throughout the film. And then they reveal that there's another villain behind the scenes, which is really, really cool. And overall, I love the style and feel of this movie, and it's such a fun ride. Unfortunately, that pacing really hurts this film, as this movie's so slow throughout the whole thing, to the point where the film has like nothing really going on, and then it kicks itself into hyperdrive in the last like 20 minutes to have this big epic end of superhero movie fight sequence that really doesn't fit in this grounded Breakfast Club horror film that I've been watching. So this is just one of those few times where I generally feel like we didn't need the big action sequence at the end, but overall, this is a fun movie, and I genuinely wish that we did end up getting a trilogy, because this was the last film in the Fox X-Men franchise that came out pre the Disney merger, and there was plans to do a whole kind of mutant horror trilogy, and I really wish we could have seen the whole thing, because if this film was any idea of what they were going to do with that premise, we were going to get some really fun sequels with the New Mutants. But unfortunately, we got that canceled because of Disney, and now we don't know where they would go. But at the same time, The New Mutants is another one of those films that doesn't really offend me, but it also doesn't do a ton that I love. So it kind of ranks in the middle of the list, but I will give it this. It's a fun movie, and it definitely deserved to be seen by a lot more people because it bombed, but I definitely think it's a really solid movie, and I do wish that more people saw it, because it just is one of the better X-Men films that weren't tied to the X-Men. And now we come to the film that started this entire universe, X-Men. This film is definitely a very interesting staple in early superhero media, because it's just a fun little side film that does a lot to set up the X-Men, but also does a lot to kind of establish this universe. And one of the main critiques I've always had with this movie and kind of with the whole Foxman X-Men franchise as a whole is that because this film was so early in like superhero media's life, because this was pre Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, the MCU, and all of those, Fox really didn't know how fantastical they could go with the franchise. So they grounded this film in reality for most of it. Most of the characters aren't using their superpowers. Instead of wearing their classic colorful costumes, they're in these stupid black leather jumpsuits. And overall, it's a film that definitely feels very much like they kind of didn't understand the assignment. Because with the X-Men, you can do some phenomenal movies. But instead, they decided to make just a boring film about people who have powers who get sent to this side school run by this old professor, and they eventually have to go up against this other guy who's running the Brotherhood of Mutants and wants to destroy the United Nations. So, you know what? Whatever. I do like a lot, though. I think this is one of the best films for Magneto. He was great. I love Ian McKellen, and he's perfect in the role, especially with a lot they do in this film. I really like the film's central dynamic with Rogue and Wolverine. I think that's a really cool dynamic to focus the film on. They give some great moments for Storm to do, but the film kind of drops the ball when it came to Jean Grey and Cyclops. I've already mentioned it a little bit, but I hate how Fox basically shafted Cyclops, as they basically took one of the coolest X-Men characters of all time and basically watered him down so heavily so that they could promote Wolverine as the face of their franchise. Like, genuinely, like, people don't realize it now, but like, we were done dirty with Cyclops when he was in control of Fox, because if you've seen X-Men 97 at all, one episode of X-Men 97 completely undid the decade-long damage Fox had been doing to Cyclops' character in one episode. Like, that takes effort. And it makes me mad because Cyclops is supposed to be so cool, and he's just not. I love that. And Jean Grey basically is just established here to be Wolverine's love interest without ever diving deep into why that's the case and setting up the love triangle that's supposed to exist between him, Cyclops, and Jean, which, again, it's fine, but I just don't like it. But overall, this film is a fine little time. It's got enjoyable moments. And again, it's not the worst thing Fox did with this franchise, but it definitely is one of those cases where, again, they kind of felt almost restricted in how superhero-y fantastical they could go with the film. And as a result, they turned out a product that's not really up to scuff. So, yeah, sorry, X-Men. And straight from X-Men, we go to X2, X-Men United. And yes, this is what I want out of an X-Men film. While yes, it still is trying to ground itself in reality with things like the leather jumpsuits and the powers don't get used that often. But at the end of the day, the film does a really good job about expanding the X-Men universe in a really good, believable way. I really do love the villain here. For how much I love Magneto, I do really love William Stryker. He's a really fun character, and I do really love this concept of a human against the X-Men as the villain, which I think worked really well. And even on the topic of Magneto, he sits in this plastic prison for like 90% of the film, but then the second he gets out, he's already working against the X-Men, and it makes for such a fun dynamic where they have to team up with him. Oh man, the villains in this movie are so well handled. I also love that this movie delved deeper into the Wolverine backstory, which was one of the reasons why I was so excited for X-Men Origins Wolverine when I first saw it, because the Wolverine backstory in this film is handled so effortlessly that it feels so great. I love that Storm got more to do in this movie because she's one of my favorite X-Men, so she was a lot of fun. We got more to do with Rogue. We get introduced to Iceman here, who's a lot of fun. I really love the vibe that went forward with this movie, where after the X-Mansion gets raided by these kind of soldiers, Wolverine has to take a couple of the kids out to kind of hide them, which I thought was a great role for him. I forgot to mention we got Nightcrawler in this movie, who's not my favorite iteration of the character, but he's really cool in that opening sequence in this movie where he invades the White House, as one of my favorite sequences in the Fox X-Men franchise. But again, we have the problems where other characters such as Jean, Cyclops, and even Charles Xavier to an extent are really shafted in favor of propping up those other characters I mentioned. And the film is even weird because it kind of shafts Jean Grey for most of it. And then all of the sudden, at the end, they want to set up the Dark Phoenix storyline by having her sacrifice herself in a movie that's barely focused on her up until this point. So that's always kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But other than that, I have very few negative things to say about X2 X-Men United. This is a very solid film throughout. It does so much more for the franchise than X-Men 1 did, but at the same time it does still have a couple of those glaring issues to where I can't really say it's my favorite X-Men film, but it definitely was a step in the right direction for the X-Men franchise before X-Men The Last Stand and X-Men Origins Wolverine kind of shafted the franchise and ran it into the ground. But hey, we've already talked about those. So now we're going to go ahead and talk about the actual good films that I like about in the Fox X-Men franchise. So next up, we have Deadpool. And I just love the Deadpool character. Ryan Reynolds was basically born to play this part, and he's so good in the role. And the film itself maybe doesn't have the strongest story ever as it does the classic. We're going to tell the origin story of Wade Wilson becoming Deadpool as he goes also on this hunt to track down Francis, who is the guy who turned him into Deadpool. And he has his occasional love interest with Vanessa, which is great. But at the same time, the film does a really good way with its structure as it intercuts Deadpool's backstory with him on this highway doing this whole fight sequence with great moments like the bullet count sequence and his initial introduction to Cyclops. I really like Cyclops and Negasonic Teenage Warhead in this film. They're really fun ways to connect Deadpool back to the X-Men without needing to bring in the whole X-Men cast, which I thought is really fun. I just love the comedy of this movie in general. I'm one of those people that is very into dirty jokes. So, of course, I really do like Deadpool's comedy sense. It's very much for me, and it makes for some very fun moments throughout the film. I love his relationship with Vanessa, which is really nice to see throughout the film. And overall, I just think Deadpool is one of those movies that it might not be the strongest when it comes to the story or anything like that, but the characters and the enjoyability of the film carry it up into the high spots on this list because, I mean, it's just a film that I don't think I dislike, even though it has elements that aren't solid. I do think the pacing is a little bit slow here and there. And after a while, you do start to forget that this movie is supposed to be a superhero film. But at the same time, it's definitely a film that I enjoy watching. So I think it definitely deserves to rank amongst some of the best films in the Fox X-Men franchise. But it definitely just still is not my favorite in the franchise, and there are others I enjoy more. So it doesn't get to rank above those, but not a bad showing for our famous red superhero in red spandex. So, you know what? We'll take what we can get. It's honestly miraculous how good X-Men First Class is. This film is such an interesting idea to go basically in this universe that we've already set up of the X-Men franchise to basically rewind and go back to tell the origins of the X-Men franchise. Now, look, we can hate on this film for all it wants for basically changing the pre-established lore of how the X-Men got founded that we were told in the first X-Men film in favor of because this film is basically not following that at all. But at the same time, it's a very fun film as it dives well deep into the backstory of both Charles, Magneto, Eric, and Mystique, while also chucking in some of the lesser known X-Men into this film. Like we have Banshee, who is a fun character. And like that, it makes for a very fun selection of characters. I love Beast's whole story in this film. They kind of tied that into this story with Mystique about how they feel they need to hide their mutations. And it kind of plays into the later films in this prequel era of the Fox X-Men franchise where Beast doesn't need to hide who he is through his mutation, which I think is really great. We have a great villain in here in the form of our Lord and Savior Kevin Bacon playing Sebastian Shaw and the Hellfire Club, who make for really fun villains, and I just love the Hellfire Club. But unfortunately, since Kevin Bacon is playing the main villain, he gives this powerhouse performance, and he kind of overshadows the entire group, which is a little unfortunate. And overall, we do also miss him throughout most of the middle chunk of this movie as we see the X-Men training to get their powers at Charles's house. We get to have this very half-baked romance relationship with Magneto and Mystique, which is kind of interesting. But at the end, also this really half-baked relationship between Rose Byrne's character and Charles, which is all right. But other than that, X-Men First Class delivers a lot of solid elements that I love, and it's a very worthwhile prequel to the X-Men franchise, and I really did love it. Also, I do have to call out the fact that of course, I hate the Darwin death in this movie. Like, his entire mutant power is he can adapt to any situation, but they just decide, oh, we're going to kill him off. We're going to kill him off in the first encounter with Sebastian Shaw so we can establish Shaw's power. So, you know what? Whatever. All other ways, this is a really fun movie, and X-Men First Class is a very solid film. It just unfortunately doesn't crack the top 3 for me, but it definitely is a solid film throughout. This might shock a lot of you, but next up, I have Deadpool 2. Now, yes, I am fully aware of the fact that, yes, the first Deadpool film might have the stronger story and might have a lot of more condensed, solid stuff in it, but I like the second one more. I'm sorry. Again, everything I said about the first Deadpool film still applies here. The comedy is still here, and honestly, I might like it a little better here in Deadpool 2. I love all of our characters, as of course we still carry over our characters like Cyclops and Negasonic Teenage Warhead, but we added in with new characters like Domino, who's a really fun character, and it was really nice to see them do a character like her that has such a weird mutant power, that being the power of luck, and really making it work really fun in a film, which I didn't think they could do, so that was really nice. We, of course, get Cable in this film, played by Josh Brolin, and he's obviously amazing. He's just so fun, and I love his eventual turn to work with Deadpool, of course. And we, of course, have Fire Fist, who's a really fun villain, and he makes for a very fun threat throughout most of the film, and it's just great. In the end, like I mentioned, Deadpool 1 might have the better story, but I cannot lie when I say that I like rewatching Deadpool 2 a lot more than the first Deadpool, so that's why it gets to rank above it, and even most of the Fox X-Men franchise, because I don't really have the need to rewatch a lot of the Fox X-Men films, but I always go ahead and be like, hey, why don't we just go through on Deadpool 2 today? So I'm going to rank it high. It just unfortunately is weighed down by the fact that there's 2 more films in the Fox X-Men franchise that are just even better than this one. So, unfortunately, Deadpool 2 doesn't get to rank higher than 3rd place, but I still think that is a more than worthwhile place for this kind of film, because it's fun and it's overall emotional and amazing, and I just love it for everything it is. Let's be honest here, you know these 2 films were gonna be the top 2 when you came into this video, because anybody who knows the Fox X-Men franchise knows that these 2 films are the best things that they ever made, and so they get to be the highest. But between these 2, which one gets to be number 2 and number 1? Well, number 2 for me, for the Fox X-Men franchise, is gonna be Logan. Logan is such an interesting film to talk about, as it's taking into account the Old Man Logan story, basically bringing into this far future of the Fox X-Men timeline where all of the other X-Men have died out, and it's just Hugh Jackman's Wolverine and Charles Xavier, played by Patrick Stewart, just trying to survive in this dissolent future, and they run into this girl, X-23 Laura, who is related to Wolverine, who they try to protect as they get her across the Canadian border. And this film is so fun while they're running away from our villain, who's a really fun villain, and he's very threatening, and I do really like his character throughout most of the runtime. We have some very interesting action in this movie, as they made this film rated R. So, of course, there's some amazing action sequences, not only from Laura herself, but we also get some great Wolverine action. Mainly, I love like that ending fight sequence where we, of course, get the emotional ending to this film that is so good. And genuinely, it's one of the most fitting ends for the Wolverine character I've ever seen in fiction, before we had some changes to it, which is great. Unfortunately, some things that do kind of hold this back from me putting it any higher is I'm not big on the X-24 twist. I just kind of think it's a really boring way to get a second villain in there, which I just don't really like, as the film didn't really need a second villain. Also, the film's pacing can be kind of poor in a few places. But other than that, this is a solid film throughout, and it's just a really fun film. Unfortunately, however, I also am not huge on more gritty superhero films, so it doesn't get to be my favorite film in this kind of franchise because X-Men Days of Future Past exists. And this film might be my favorite Marvel film, or one of my favorite Marvel films of all time. In fact, I might go on a limb and say that this film is better than everything in the MCU. X-Men Days of Future Past is such an interesting film, basically taking all the convoluted lore we've built up over the course of the Fox X-Men franchise with the original trilogy and the prequel film, and merging them together into such an interesting time travel story that really works for what it is. I do really, of course, love the future segments before we get into the past, as the Sentinels are so terrifying villains, and you really get to see how much scary they are from the opening sequence alone, and they're so great. And even seeing the future segments where you got Magneto and Storm teaming up to take out some Sentinels is such an epic sequence. And then we go into the past, and we get such a fun story of the classic time travel story of, is the future destined, or can we steer things down a different path? As we get to see a really great reverse dynamic where it's Wolverine leading Beast and Charles down a path and kind of changing their fates, which is great. We, of course, got our first look at Evan Peters as Quicksilver in this film, who is such a fun little character. We get to have some great backstory moments with both Mystique's story, who has a really fun character in this story, which was the only, in my opinion, this is one of the only other films in the franchise where making Mystique an anti-hero actually worked. Of course, I love the past version of Magneto. They did a really good job with Michael Fassbender here. And overall, this film keeps you guessing throughout the whole time of if they're actually going to change the past. And it makes for such a satisfying film. And you also, of course, have Peter Dinklage in this movie playing our villain, who makes for such a fun villain because even though he's not in the movie a ton, he at least is in enough of the movie. And when he is in the movie, you absolutely despise him. So, yes, X-Men Days of Future Past is my favorite film in the Fox X-Men franchise, and it also might be one of my favorite Marvel films of all time. So there you guys have it, my ranking of all 13 films in the Fox X-Men franchise. Sure, this franchise was very up and down with its quality, delivering us some excellent films in the franchise like X-Men Days of Future Past, Logan, and Deadpool 2, but then also giving us a lot of garbage in the forms of Dark Phoenix, X-Men Origins, Last Stand, and Apocalypse. But at the end of the day, the Fox X-Men franchise still does hold a place in a lot of our hearts, as of course it was our first time seeing the X-Men on the big screen, it was a much more worthwhile addition, especially that now that we're going to be seeing a lot of these characters in Doomsday later this year. I'm just more happy I rewatched these films just to get more of a sense of what I was working with when we get there. So, without further ado, if you want to take on the challenge of ranking all 13 films in the Fox X-Men franchise, leave your rankings down in the comments and maybe we can get a conversation going. But without further ado, thank you guys all very much for watching this ranking video, and hope to see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.